Thank you so much to everyone who that has come here timelessly. We're just waiting for a few more people to trickle in. So if you could just bear with us for another 5 minutes, that would be appreciated. But you can use the time for conversation and meeting new people. Thank you. Molweni, and welcome to the Nelson Mandela Foundation. My name is Sumaya Hendricks, and I am the head of the Dialogue and Advocacy Program here at the Foundation. I'd like to extend a warm welcome to you all. This is a hybrid event, so thank you so much to everyone that's joining us here in person at the Foundation, as well as our audience online. This dialogue is the third installment of the Critical Dialogue series. The first one we had was entitled, "What Does This Moment Call For?" And the second one was centered around the role of civil society in the elections. And if anyone would like to view those dialogues, it's available on our YouTube channel. So the foundation started doing work on land in 2018. And soon after it started focusing on land, it then narrowed its focus around urban land. Now, at the time, there was quite a lot of focus on land. There were various reports and commissions that were set up by government. And even though the landscape has changed and that is not so prominent in our public discourse, as a foundation, we recognize that the issue of land will continue to haunt us as a country until we meaningfully address it. So we have to ask ourselves, how long can we wait as a country before we reckon with the pain of the past, and before we do the difficult but important repair and redistributive work, especially in relation to land. So as the foundation, we are here with the intention of trying to grapple and reflect on the content that will be discussed, and we call you into the space to also do that. So in terms of the structure of the dialogue, we're going to be commencing with a keynote address by Advocate Tembeka Ngungatobi for about 20 minutes. He will then enter into a discussion with Nolundi Lawaya for about 35 minutes, after which point Nolundi will then open it up to audience engagement, because we really do see the audience as a third panelist. And then just before we wrap up, before 1 o'clock, we're going to be hearing from our very esteemed acting CEO, Vern Harris, who will be doing a closing and a vote of thanks. Now, our keynote speaker needs very little introduction, Advocate Tembeka. I was trying to do extensive research on his bio, and one of the websites described him as a prominent and talented advocate that I don't think anyone will disagree with. One of them even officially had as the bio as that he is a superstar. I kid you not. But he's also, other than being in the law sphere, he's someone who thinks and writes a lot about land, and has written 2 books, Land is Ours and Land Matters in this area. So it gives me great pleasure to call him up to deliver his remarks.
Thank you, Sumaya. And good morning, everyone. This is a long thing that I wrote here, so I think I am just going to try and summarize the salient parts because I only have 20 minutes. So what I thought, in order to make the discussion meaningful, is to talk specifically about restitution as well as redistribution as the sort of anchor points of my discussion. Because both of them will try and open up the discussion for the future about where do we go from here. So the brief background is, what happened during the transition is that the ANC had various plans about land. It had the Ready to Govern, and it had the RDP document. Those were then subsequently consolidated into the guidelines for the Bill of Rights. Now, both the Ready to Govern document as well as the RDP document thought that the way to fix the problem of land dispossession is not to ask a historical question alone. It is to ask a contemporary question, which is, why is there so much land hunger or land injustice. So that's the key to the RDP document as well as the Ready to Govern document. Their purpose is to try and resolve land injustice, the fact that so many black people have little land and so many white people have so much land. They also contained a section on restitution of land. And that section on the restitution of land focused on a narrower aspect, and that's one of the things we don't fully grasp, on a narrower aspect of land reform, which is how to resolve the problem of forced removals. How to resolve the problem of forced removals. And the forced removals were the forced removals from the 1913 Native Land Act and the Group Areas Act, the Influx Control Regulations, the Bantustan legislation, etc. So there was a narrower focus under restitution, which was forced removals. And the numbers were also known. The actual victims of forced removals were known. There were 5.7 million people that were victims of forced removals. And you find this in the book by Desmond Cosmas, the actual numbers. And the government, the ANC was working on those numbers as well. So those were the two primary projects. What they thought at the time was that the land situation in South Africa will not be resolved by restitution. So they were quite clear that restitution will not resolve them. What will resolve it is land redistribution, right? Now, what then happened is that they negotiated both the interim and the final constitution on that assumption. And during that negotiation, there was intense contestation about both of these concepts of restitution and of redistribution. And I've gone through the notes of the CODESA as well as the notes of those technical committees. You see, young people these days, they say that the CODESA minutes are missing. The CODESA minutes are not missing. They're in the archives. So you can find them there, and you'll see the discussion. The National Party was represented by Sheila Camera in those negotiations. She completely opposed the idea of restitution, that it should be constitutionalized. So that was the white position. And she was representing the South African government in the Property Technical Committee, which subsequently became the Section 25 Technical Committee. And so her view was that you cannot constitutionalize the right of return. This right of restitution, that's the right of return. This idea that people that were once removed, whether it is under colonialism or under apartheid, should go back. That was contested. The second point that she made was that if land is to be taken from basically white people, I'm not trying to be offensive when I say this, but I'm trying to just give the graphic illustration. So if land is to be taken from white people, right, the state should make the payment. And the state should make the payment on the basis of the international standard of prompt compensation, which is based on market value. Right? So that's the second point that she made. And the third point that she made was that there should in fact be a right to property in the Constitution itself. Those were the three major arguments that she made. Now, these were opposed by the ANC. The ANC was represented by Penuel Maduna and who was the other representative there? And Bridget Mabandla. So they argued that, firstly, we need the right of return in the Constitution. It must be constitutionalized. Otherwise, you sanitize and allow the status quo then to persist. They also argued that there should be no right to receive compensation on a market value, which is the international standard. Instead, if compensation is to be paid at all, it should be on an equitable basis, which takes into account the interests, or the public interest, and the interest of the affected parties. And then they also argued for the right of expropriation. The state needed the power to expropriate. And that power of expropriation was necessary in order to resolve the problem identified in the RDP document and in the Ready to Govern document, which is the problem that South Africa faces is the problem of land injustice or land hunger. There are just too many black people without land and too few white people with a lot of land. That's really the problem they were trying to solve. And so they insisted on the power of expropriation to be included in the Constitution. And they opposed the right to property. When the final text was produced, the ANC won every one of those debates. It won each and every one. Like completely, not even sort of a compromise position. It won every one of those debates. Because the Constitution produced no right to property. Right? It also produced the right to expropriate. It also did not produce the right to be paid compensation at market value, which is the international standard. It also produced the right of return, the right of restitution. So those were the negotiating positions of the ANC. All of them were successful. And all of the negotiating positions of Sheila Kamara were rejected. So then we come back to the objectives, the political objectives of the ANC, forgetting about what the law ultimately produced. The political objectives, which is one, we want to resolve the problem of land injustice and land hunger in South Africa, and we are going to do it via redistribution. In other words, by simply taking the land, by the mechanism of expropriation and refusing to pay the owners what they are demanding and paying them what we believe is just and equitable. Right? The problem then starts post the adoption of the Constitution. Right? That's where the problem really starts. Because what we see there is that there is a radical shift in the policy orientation of the ANC. So it no longer focuses on redistribution as the instrument of transformation. It instead focuses on restitution. Right? Now, it's an obvious problem when you focus on restitution, because even on the own calculations of the ANC, the problem of restitution was limited to 5.7 million people. So even if you restituted everyone, you took everybody that was a victim of the Native Land Act, the Group Areas Act, and the various influx control regulations. So if you gave them everything, you are still going to resolve only a problem of 5.7 million people. Right? And so you can never resolve the problem they identified of land hunger and land injustice by restitution. And secondly, you have a cutoff date. You have a cutoff date of the 19th of June, 1913. And in the ANC's own documents, there is clear evidence that they were aware that the cutoff date is a problem. For the obvious reasons. I mean, in June 1913, the land is already in the hands of whites, you see, because they've obtained it during the period of war. And there is already law that exists. The Glen Grey Act is the best example of the law that prohibits blacks from buying land without the permission of the state. So they know there's two problems. Problem one being that it's only going to resolve a 5.7 million number of claims. And problem two, it is the cutoff period, so it's limited in time. But nevertheless, they drive the land reform, process under the restitution provisions of the Constitution. That's what they do. And their focus then is this idea that through restitution, we are going to have a 30% agricultural land ownership in black hands by 1999. And they're doing this based on, and it's actually fascinating to see how that number is arrived at, because that number is actually based on the commercial land sales that they have at the time. So what they see is that there is 6% per annum of land transfers. And so they work on that 6%, and they say, well, if we work on this basis over a period of 5 years, we can achieve 30%. So it's a very conservative number, but they say we can achieve 40%. But the problem is that they don't go back to the policy issue, which is, well, the only way to do this is by redistribution, in other words, by an aggressive program of the state, simply acquiring the land through the instrument of expropriation. And so they think this will be achieved by restitution. We know now that in the first 5 years, the number was paltry. It hardly crossed 1%. We know now, after 30 years, which is the good time to be reevaluating this, that after 30 years, in my own book, I put the number at 9% on what I had read, and there were complaints from professors in Stellenbosch that I didn't get the number correct. It should actually be at 18%, blah, blah, blah. Fine, But this was resolved by President Ramaphosa last year at the ANC conference, when he said the government's own number is 11%. So I then said, it turns out that I was not far from the truth. So on their own numbers, we are still at 11% of what we should have been. And if you compare this against the target of 30% in the first 5 years, it's clear that this is a dismal performance, right? And in fact, the report by former President Kgalema Motlanthe, puts this in perspective, basically saying, if we continue according to the current projection, we have another 708 years to wait. So that's like really when you get down to it, that's really where we are. So people have then asked the question, well, should we then abandon restitution? So restitution is not working, right? So the government can explain itself, excuse itself, whatever. The fact is that on all of the research outputs, whether it's the panel on land or whether it is the high-level panel, everybody agrees now that restitution is not working. Right? It's not producing the outcomes. It's not resulting in land going to black people. And when it does, black people are not sufficiently capable of maintaining the productive capacity of the land. And again, the numbers are here. I put these numbers in my book. 79%. Okay, so I had a big fight about whether it was 83% or 79%. So some people from Stellenbosch said it was 79%. Anyway, I said it was 83%. But the fact is that around 80% of farms that have been acquired under the restitution program are fallow. They are not working. They're not producing the amount of food or the amount of produce that they produced prior to the transfer. So it's not working because blacks are not getting the land, and it's not working because even when they do get the land, there is no productive output in those farms. That's around 80%. So there is clearly a crisis of restitution. The program is not working. And that is why there has been a debate, certainly in the last 5 years, it's become sharper, championed by Professor Ben Cousins, who asked the question, is it time to abandon restitution entirely? I've argued that the symbolic value of restitution means that we cannot abandon it, even though the economics of it are showing that it is failing. Right? I've argued that the symbolism. This right of return is something very, very symbolic to black people who are victims of forced removals. So we need to sustain and maintain and keep restitution. But I've also argued that I recognize that restitution cannot in fact be the future of land reform. This idea that people need to return to their original places where they were taken away by white people, whether under colonialism or under apartheid, that is not going to work. And that is what South Africans are refusing to confront. That's not going to work. Because it means for me that if I want land, what options do you have if you want land? You really have three options. One is you must buy the land in the open market. Many of us cannot afford the land because it's too expensive. The other is that I must lodge a restitution claim. But many of us simply cannot prove that we were victims of forced removals. I cannot prove that I was a victim of forced removals. And millions of people cannot prove that they were victims of forced removals. What they have is a general idea, that just because they're black, then they must have been victims, but they have no tangible evidence that they were in fact victims of forced removals. And the restitution process works in a very legalistic way. You have to go through the stages of proving, the things you have to prove. You've got to prove that you are either the person who was dispossessed or related to them or their child or their grandchild, etc. But there has to be some sort of a biological connection between you and the original act of dispossession. But there are other things that also have to be proven, that dispossession was racially motivated. And also that at the time of the dispossession, there was no just an equitable payment that was made. And most of the things most of the trials, really, land trials, require a lot of resources. So even if you did have that evidence, the problem is getting through the system. You often need an attorney, mostly an advocate as well, sometimes an accountant, often a property valuer, sometimes a historian, sometimes and somebody who's an expert in customary law. What do you call those, Nolund? Customary law experts. So you'll have to go to the community, consult with them, and get some clarity. So the amount of resources you need to lodge a claim means that many people are unable to lodge claims, even if they have valid claims. So simply cannot lodge a claim. So what this means is that we have to go back then to redistribution, which was the original idea of the ANC. And the way redistribution was actually meant to work is simple. It's really, really, really simple. It was supposed to ask whether or not you need land and you cannot afford it. That is how the ANC thought the problem was going to be solved. And whether you lived in the city or lived in the rural areas did not matter, as long as you needed land and you couldn't afford it. You had a right to ask the state to ensure that you have what they call in the Constitution equitable access to land. But they never did anything about this ever since the Constitution was passed in 1996. They just did nothing about it at all. And they could never implement redistribution without a law of general application. And the recent activity around the Expropriation Act is also not going to work for land reform. Right? It's very crucial to think about what we are talking about. Because the Expropriation Act is not an instrument of land reform. It's not an instrument to enable the state to acquire land for redistribution, which is what the problem is. And it's also not going to work because the focus is not on private land, right? And the only way to get land for wider redistribution is to take it from private hands. Again, South Africans are refusing to confront this problem. So the land has to be taken from private hands. The idea that the land is going to come from the state and the government owns this, the municipalities own this. There is no land that is owned by the state that is capable of resolving the problem of land injustice. South Africa has, I think it's 130 million hectares in total, the total land surface, something like 130 million. I mean, you have to exclude the rivers and the oceans and whatever, and just look at physical ground. 130 million hectares. The state proper owns 18 million of those hectares, owns 18 million. Only 2 million of those hectares are available for redistribution, right? Only 2 million. But even that 2 million, the problem is that you'll find that it is forests, it's not things or it's railway lines, so it's not things you can actually take and use. So which means that if we are going to implement redistribution, which is truly the future of land reform, we have to swallow the pill that the land will come from private hands. So you've got to swallow that pill, the land will come from private hands. And the owners of the land are not going to hand it to the state. I saw the ANC saying the other day, and I wrote actually, I saw the ANC saying something about land donations. I just don't understand how they can think that they will resolve land reform through land donations. But it's part of a larger problem that the ANC thinks that it can outsource this problem to the private sector. Let's ask the owners of the land to resolve the problem. But that too is not going to work. So then I want to end then with only 2 points. So it seems clear to me that although there is symbolic value in the restitution program, it has now reached its sell-by date. The government can no longer rely on restitution as an instrument of land reform. It needs to move towards redistribution. But in order to make redistribution work, the state needs to accept 2 facts or realities. The one is that it needs to pursue an expropriation program more aggressively. And the second is that it must accept that the land will come from private hands. Thank you.
Thank you, Thembeka, for those remarks. I'm always stumped after remarks of that nature because I'm not sure what quite to say to thank him for that input. But I'm sure I speak on behalf of everyone when I say that I'm looking forward to the discussion that's going to ensue now. I'd like to just take the opportunity to introduce Nolundi, who's going to be moderating the discussion. She is the director of LARC, which is the Land and Accountability Research Center. She's been very involved with the Traditional Courts Bill campaign, the Restitution Amendment Bill campaign, and she's also taught extensively on customary land rights. I think this is the first time we've hosted here at the Foundation, and I look forward to further engagements. And thank you so much for coming all the way from a sunny Cape Town to a much colder Johannesburg to be with us. If I can please call up Nolundi and Thembeka. Thanks.
Fantastic. I'm just checking the sound is good. Okay, perfect. Awesome. Good morning still, everybody. And my thanks to the Nelson Mandela Foundation for hosting what is, I think, quite an important discussion. You and I have spoken about this a lot, so I apologize that some of it will perhaps feel a bit repetitive. But what I wanted to do was sort of pick up on some of the specific points that you made in your keynote and ask you to expand on 1 or 2 of those, just partly, I think, out of further deepening the conversation. And then I wanted to open the conversation up a little bit and explore some broader themes around sort of, land and politics, land and law, and then open it up for the wider audience. So I'm not going to bend your ear for too long because I think you've probably had enough of hearing me. So Thembeka, I want to swing around to a couple of points that you made in your keynote, as I said. So you were speaking, describing the kind of CODESA process, the position of the National Party, and the position of the ANC. And you were speaking about how in the final text of the Constitution, constitution on paper, all of those ANC positions were supported and they came out as the final reflection. What I'm interested in is to just kind of hear your thinking about what has played out, obviously, in the years following the final constitution. The first is around the interpretation that seems to exist quite a lot in academic circles, that Section 25(1) of the Constitution is read as a right to property, right? So it's the section that prohibits the deprivation, the arbitrary deprivation of property. And so there are schools of thought that say that that basically is something that protects people's right to property. And I'm interested in your thoughts on that. And then also your thoughts on, you did speak about, obviously the ANC took a massive shift in terms of their position, but they had opposed in the CODESA negotiations market value as the standard of compensation. In practice, we know that that has played out very differently, particularly in the restitution program. In fact, it's the ANC itself that often has fallen kind of into that market value position. They've also taken, conservative stances like willing buyer, willing seller. So I just wondered about, if you wanted to say something a bit more about those two aspects and how in practice actually the sort of successful outcome of the positions they advanced has, through their own kind of practice and policies been reneged on.
Yeah, no, thank you. I mean, I think I get annoyed when I hear Section 25 is a betrayal and sellout. It's just like really, really annoying. The fact of the matter is that the ANC won every point in the debate on Section 25. It got what it wanted. It must now implement it. That's the problem. But it got what it wanted. This is what it went there to negotiate for. And then it got it as it is. So, and that's why I rejected the ANC's pretentious approach to Section 25, that it's now pretending as if it's constrained by Section 25. That's what it wanted. It must now live with it. And so this whole thing, where we want to amend Section 25 because it's a stumbling block, etc., it's pure politics. They went there, they negotiated for it, they got it, so they must now give effect to it. Now, the first point around interpretation of Section 25, there are judgments which say that it's a negative protection. But the point I was making is that Sheila Kamara wanted a positive protection. She wanted a clause that was similar to Section 23(1) of the interim constitution, which said there is a right to acquire, own, and dispose of property. And that was the whole point during those 2 years, is that you can't have that right because it only will apply in favor of the property classes. But there was still another problem, which was a political problem, which was how do you actually resolve the problem of the transition? And you have various options. I mean, one option is whites who obtained land and property, not just land and property under apartheid, would keep that, right? And they would not necessarily lose it during the transition. Or they would lose it during the transition, and then it will be open for wider redistribution by the state. There are some countries that took that line. The ANC approach was they will keep it. Again, we must face that reality. And the ANC was not alone, actually. This was the position in Zimbabwe. In fact, I found the Lancaster Constitution itself. That was the clause, even in the Lancaster Constitution in 79, that the property you've obtained under colonialism, you keep it. So that was the deal. And even in Namibia, the property you got under apartheid, you keep it. What we do then, we give the state the power to take it from you, provided the state jumps the hoops of showing that it's going to be used for a wider redistribution, etc. So there is no, at least on the text, there's no positive right. There is some negative right. So if they are saying there's a right, it's a very weak right. But the ANC did want also, ANC did want to protect property. That's the funny thing. Because what they were arguing was that the National Party, one of the key facets of apartheid was depriving Africans of property. So the balance that they had to strike was, how do we make sure that we protect the existing? It was little property, but it existed. So we protect it. And that's important, whenever you are talking about the power of expropriation. You want to protect the little property that Africans had during the transition. But you want to expand that, and so you need to have a carefully calibrated clause that would be capable of protecting Africans who have acquired property despite the difficulties. Because, that's what colonialism was about. Colonialism was really about the process of deacertification and taking away from, brown-skinned, flat-nosed people. So this is what the ANC had to grapple with, is how do we protect that property and how do we take so that we can redistribute without disrupting the rule of law. And this is why then Section 25(1) reflects this negative protection. But it's not a reflection of a compromise, because the National Party was clear, we want a full protection, and the ANC was clear, we want a negative protection. So this was an ANC position itself. So that's the one thing to say about the text we ultimately got of Section 25(1). The market value story is interesting in terms of its own historical evolution, because it was also a point of contestation. The National Party wanted market value. It said so. It made it clear we want market value. In fact, it was not just the National Party, by the way. It was supported by the IFP. So the IFP also said it wanted market value, and the DP said it wanted market value. And the ultimate point eventually is debated in the Constitutional Court during the certification. The problem is in 1997, it's when the ANC adopts the white paper on land. That's really the problem, because there they write in the white paper that the state policy will be willing seller, willing buy. Willing seller, willing buy. And from 1997, the ANC followed a willing seller, willing buy, which was a betrayal of the 1996 Constitution. And they have always followed extreme forms of willing seller, willing buyer, where if you are buying land that is close enough to a city, they're not even going to value it at proper market value. They will value it at the highest possible use of the land, which is above market value, because it assumes that if the land were used as a township, what would the value be? Which is even higher than market value. And in some housing cases, that is how they have actually bought the land. They've bought it at more than the market value. So that's been the real policy problem. And even now, the state actually still applies market value, and it contradicts what is in the constitution. So that's been the source of it. It's been that white paper. Even now, the ANC has this rhetoric, that we've got to give black people land, etc. But they still follow a market value policy. Now, if you try to get land, and then they will get 3 valuers, and all of those valuers will be looking at market value. And the strange thing with market value is that it has always been a fiction. I went through, when I was writing Land Matters, judgments of the Union era. So if you look at the judgments in 1911 or 1912, because the state, the Union wanted a lot of land, for the occupation of white people. And it had to acquire it somewhere, and some of it was taken basically from native people, from black people. And if the Roman Dutch idea was that people must be compensated fairly or according to the market standard, you would have expected the market value to be. But if you look at those judgments, what they say, they reject market value. They say market value in expropriation is a fiction, because you can never have a willing seller and a willing buyer in an open market, because there's no open market. There's only one buyer, it's the government. There is one seller, and that seller is selling forcefully. It's a compulsory sale. And there's no open market, because the state is acquiring that land for a specific purpose. It's trying to resolve a problem of homelessness or a problem of a school, etc., etc. And so even the ANC's approach is, in fact, in conflict with what the National Party was doing. I mean, when the National Party, the Expropriation Act of 1975, the one we're still applying now, the reason they needed it is because if you go to Parliament and see what they were doing there in the old Hansards, they had decided they're going to do homelands. But in order to do a homeland, you need the state to be able to just buy the land. And if you happen to be a Sotho speaker, but you're in a Xhosa area, you need to be forced out. And so the way to force you out is expropriation, which is why they passed the 1975 expropriation. It was really a statute to assist the National Party to implement the homelands. So that's been the problem, the policy problem. I mean, there have been other problems of corruption, etc., but I thought let's not bore the audience with those. But yeah.
No, agreed. I'm going to move on. I want to come to this point about productivity.
Yeah.
And so you're speaking obviously about the need for redistribution to be, the kind of the focus and the area in which we turn to for land reform. And this question about productivity, productive use, is one that has haunted restitution for a long time. But it's one that's actually haunted redistribution to the extent that we've managed it as well, right? And so there are questions in my mind about, is it fair to use kind of productive use as the standard, as the measure? Because what often happens is, at least in the redistribution programs, the farms will be returned or given to black farmers, and they will be expected to maintain the same kind of levels of productivity that were met by the previous white owner. In an instance where you don't have generational legacy of kind of, having farmed that land, you don't have the same kind of long history of skills being transferred, is it really fair to kind of be assessing black farmers on the same level, on the same standards as white farmers? But also I wanted you to just expand a little bit more on kind of this productivity point, because, one does worry that it begins to become something that's used to kind of say, well, what's the point of giving farms to black people? Because they can't farm, and now food insecurity, et cetera, when we know that there's a lot more to that argument.
Yeah, what happened actually is interesting. When Van Riebeeck was here, he was, well, not here, in the Cape. And this is a discussion that's happening, I think it's 1657. I found it in the Van Riebeeck diaries. So they've decided, so they have a problem of these, they call them free beggars. The farmers who have decided that they no longer want to be controlled by the VOC, the Dutch East India Company. They're running away, they want freedom. Yeah. And the VOC has a challenge. Well, how do we actually maintain these relationships with these rebel farmers? And one of the strategies that they adopt is creating a farming class. Creating a farming class. So what they do is they guarantee them land. I mean, of course, the land is taken from the Khoi. There's no. They take it from the Khoi. But they do two more things, right? And this is done by the VOC itself. The one is they exempt them from taxation. So exempted from taxation for a period of 3 years. The second is that they guarantee them the market. They say, whatever you produce, we will buy. So suddenly, these free beggars have got the three fundamentals you need for a successful farm. You've got free labor, no taxation, and access to market. Right? And that is the beginning of the quote-unquote successful farming community in the Cape, which is what it is today. Whether it was vineyards or whether it was apples, oranges, etc. It goes back to that era of Van Riebeeck, and it goes back to the Van Riebeeck scheme that was introduced, which guaranteed free labor, free land, no tax, access to markets. Now, if that is how the farming actually began in the Cape, like as a fact, that is how it began, and you see this in the diaries. And Van Riebeeck was very proud about this, because now they could show that the colonization of the Cape was a success. So the strange thing is how the ANC thinks it can do this without those three. The ANC thinks that it can take a farm which was used by one man with 500 laborers and give it to 300 families. And then not guarantee them markets, not guarantee them no taxation, and not guarantee them state subsidy and state support, and then think that this is going to work. I mean, it makes no sense at all. So in other words, what we have here is black farmers are sort of set up for failure, like really set up for failure. And so that example of Van Riebeeck, right, you can multiply that even under the apartheid era, particularly around the land bank, because that is how farming has always worked. It's always been a state-subsidized product. This idea that there are these excellent farmers and they will do all of this work, etc. I mean, so that never works. So you always need the state, at the very least, to help you to acquire the land, to help you with money, and also to help you with markets. Yeah. And that's been the problem we've had in South Africa, is that the state is missing in helping black farmers with access to markets or giving them money. And what they did in 2004, I don't know why they thought this was a good idea, but in 2004, the ANC amended the Land Bank Act so that because initially there was no requirement in the Land Bank Act to borrow against security, right? But now the Land Bank Act required that you borrow against security. I mean, and the whole thing makes no sense, because if you borrow against security, you need to first have security. But the reason you are borrowing is so that you can create security. I mean, the logic of it just really defeats me. So which means the Land Bank cannot be a proper DFI. It cannot be a proper developmental finance institution. It's like ABSA, it's like Standard Bank, etc. But despite all of that, when you look now, I mean, I checked this in 2014 at the loan book of the Land Bank. I found that it was 80% white farmers. And they were not paying the loans. And no one wants to say this, okay, well, because white farmers are supposed to be these excellent farmers. But despite all of this thing, I know this is all critical. Despite all of this thing, I still insist that, well, if you're going to take a farm that is producing food, you shouldn't be compromising food security. The country needs food security. And it's an indictment that it's white farmers that are primarily responsible for producing food in this country. I mean, I read something somewhere that in 1985, something like 90% of what you consume at home was from the garden, and you only supplemented from the shops by 10%, buying Aromat and Wholesome, all of this. But today, it's the reverse. It's something like 95% of what you consume is from the shop. And almost zero is actually from the garden. So which means even at the level of producing to feed us, forget about producing to feed the nation, producing to feed ourselves, we simply can't. So what kind of freedom is this?
I then want to kind of circle back to the point that you ended on, right? The two hard truths that we need to accept, which is the one, a need for a more aggressive use of expropriation, and the second one was your point that land is going to have to come from private hands. So I'm wondering, again, another sort of red herring I think that gets thrown into these conversations about land reform is obviously the racial dynamic. And so when you say land needs to come from private hands, how do we have that conversation without it kind of descending into a we need to take land from white people? And how do we have the conversation in a way that can respond to the kind of fear-mongering that comes up, that it'll tank the economy, it'll freak out investors, it'll sort of descend into this lawless rampage. How do we have that conversation? How do we actually get to a point where we're talking about it so that we can accept that truth?
Look, I don't know, let me be frank. I don't know how to... I mean, the strange thing with this idea that in other words, if we are more radical or maybe aggressive, let me not use radical, in enforcing the Constitution, right? that will result in a sort of social instability. The problem is that we already have social instability. So I just don't understand what the issue is. We already have social instability now, and we have it in conditions where we have a market fundamentalist approach to economic transformation. And everything the ANC government does is driven by the market, right? And it has produced extreme forms of poverty. I mean, South Africa now is the most unequal. I mean, they call it the Gini coefficient, basically looking at the guy that earns the highest and the guy that earns the lowest, Gini coefficient. So look at the gap between the two. So but we see it as a social fact as well. There are just too many. I mean, I was at home in the province, in the rural Eastern Cape last week and the week before. The number of unemployed people that come to me to ask for money, like any amount, you actually feel, sorry that you have to give an old man 10 rands, but you have to. So as a social reality, there is already a radical decline in the standard of living of African people. So I don't understand what is the fear, of actually charting a new path, because the existing agreement, let's call it that, the 1994 agreement, is not working. It's not working. And what we have, we've got these laws, the great laws, but the problem is that they are not being matched by social fact. So when we ask for their implementation, they are also complaining about that. And when other people are asking for their scrapping, they're complaining about that as well. So you end up having an elite, that has pillaged and plundered this country for 350 years. And that just wants no change. So I don't know how one has that conversation in a way that does not result in sort of I don't know what it's going to do, capital flight, whatever. But I don't know if the things I say, I think that most of the things I say are quite measured. But, I remember in 2008, I was asked by the then Minister of Public Works, Toko Didiza, to help with the draft expropriation bill, which I did. And I thought that it was a relatively moderate bill. The banks, everyone protested. The ANC was under pressure. They pulled the bill out, right? Until there was an attempt now to amend the constitution. And then they said, where's your bill, by the way? Let's bring it back. So I think what is happening is that there are people who just do not want any kind of change. And it doesn't matter how moderate you are. They just refuse. So maybe it's time to actually put the people that are outside of the economy into the equation and let them drive the conversation. And maybe even us as the elites, actually, maybe we are the stumbling block, and maybe that's the problem. We should be getting out of the room.
I think that's a very important point. So I want to kind of step back a bit from the points you were raising in your keynote and kind of speak a little bit more generally. The one is, you make a very strong case for redistribution as the vehicle to take land reform forward. However, we obviously are sitting in a very different position now to the position we were in 30-odd years ago and at the start of the democratic government. And so at this current point, we're obviously sitting with a state that has massive constraints, financial, from human resource all across the spectrum. It's being described as an incapable state at this point. And so the question becomes, if we are to take redistribution as the vehicle, we do have to be honest about what the state can actually do in its current form where it's currently sitting. And I'm just wondering if you have thoughts about, what that reality means. What could have been possible had we driven redistribution hard 30 years ago versus what is possible now, given where we are. We're sitting with, a medium-term budget statement that clearly makes it evident that more cuts are coming for departments. It's been described as as an austerity budget. We know that the department, for example, is severely under-resourced. What do we do based on the reality that we're in right now?
I mean, I accept your first point that the 30 years do represent a missed opportunity. I wouldn't call them lost years, but certainly, I mean, look, it was a good thing to have freedom, you know, so that we can sit here and insult the government and not be arrested. So freedom was a good thing. But I accept that on land reform, the 30 years have been a missed opportunity. And that there was money, there's no money now. But I still think that the options we face on whether it's homelessness, but basically just people needing a place to live or people needing a place to feed themselves from, will not be resolved under the current trajectory that thinks that land reform has to be housed under restitution. They will only be resolved by an acceptance that there is a land injustice, and it will be resolved through an aggressive use of an expropriation scheme. And the expropriation scheme has to insist that land is too expensive in South Africa. That's one of the problems. It's just too expensive. And a lot of people acquire the land for speculation. And we have to be able to enable the state to acquire that land for wider redistribution. There are complications there, but I think we have to make a start.
You stopping there? No, I'm joking. That's fine.
Yeah.
Let me ask you my last point, and then let's take some hands in the audience. So obviously the work that you do is predominantly in the legal sphere. You work with law. You sit and have sat as a judge in the Land Claims Court. Yeah. Out of curiosity, I'm wondering, is there a legal intervention? Is there a legal argument? Is there a case that you sometimes wish could be brought to those forums? Is there something we're missing in terms of other ways of using the law? There's a large pattern, of course, of using it, defensively, so trying to protect against dispossession. Many of the cases that have been brought against things like the Restitution Act have been procedural, largely challenging Parliament. So is there something we're missing in how we've used the law to this extent? Yeah,
no, I think the failure of the government to pass legislation to give effect to redistribution is unconstitutional. I think that if there is a case to be brought, it is to obtain a declaratory order against Parliament. That the failure to actually do land reform and proper land reform lies in redistribution. I think that we've largely been living in a sort of an unconstitutional space. That's one, and I think it's a simple and a straightforward case. I've tried to sponsor many NGOs to bring that case. No one has taken up the challenge. The second is that there has to be a constitutional declaration that willing seller, willing buyer is unconstitutional.
Thank you. All right. My understanding is there are some colleagues in the room who can help with a mic, or are folks just going to use their outside voice? Okay, fantastic. I see a hand here. Can I see a couple more? Okay, so let's go. The gentleman in the cap is 1. The lady in the glasses is 2. Chap in the white shirt is 3. Ma'am in the front is 4, and sir is 5. I see you, and I will come back for a second round. So could we start here? Is there a microphone? Behind you, sir.
Thank you very much, Archbishop Seraphim. 22 years ago, I participated as a member of the National Religious Forum about the problem of land. My question is, how can we improve legislation, as you mentioned? You mentioned the term land injustice. You report that people thought they stole money and you managed to succeed. What about the people who stole the land? You know, you remember when Matimba died, his son died. His close friends, George Bezos and George Pabotas, invited me to go there. He stopped eating, he stopped drinking water. And it was when there was the assassination of Rabin, the Prime Minister of Israel. And instead to tell us anything about his son, he told us, this man dying for peace because he wants to give back the land they stole from other people. I couldn't understand this at that time. But when I was in Israel, in Jerusalem for a conference, 2 days before Hamas attack, I remember it. And there's some Palestinians, they explained me, in 1967, they took their houses, their land, and these people are waiting. I am against of the terrorists, I am against of what Hamas did. So can you tell us what is the international law about land? Because the problem of South Africa is not a local one. It's a global problem, as we are talking about the global structure of economy. How can we change the numbers? Like in every country, the 77% of the population to be owners of 77 owners of the land. And how the 7% of the population to be owners of the 7%. How can we bring this justice? So the problem is the lack of legislation or the lack of justice. And then, what about corruption? You mentioned some people who were involved in the commission for restore justice for land. And now I think you are a clever man. These people who were responsible to work for the people who they didn't have land, they have very pieces of land. They have mines. Listen, do you disagree? If we see the names you mentioned, and to go to this book they publish every year, who are the owners of the land and of the mines, we are going to see some people there. No? Because I know a member of my church who is working with these people. Huh? Okay. So the lady, she challenged the state. But you put the things in the right direction when you mentioned the parliament. So we need a sort of education for the members of the parliament to know what to do. But I think we have to see, and you are the right person with the other people, how to see it on a global level.
Thank you.
And how to improve, because also during the last 30 years we're working about the Sustainable Development Goals. So the land can be a blessing for the country. We follow now the spirit of Matimba in other countries to solve problems. So the land can contribute, first of all, to get the dream of Matimba, the kids from the nursery school until the university to have free education. But also, what do you think about, for example, if somebody has a small piece of land, not to pay any tax, and when you have more and more and more, to come to the level to ask to pay taxes 200%, 300%. But the money the government is going to get for these taxes, we are not going to give white checks. We are going to tell the people who cultivate the land, because now we have the problem, one of you mentioned the security food. Now we are going to experience these problems. So when we know that in rural areas somebody is going to cultivate the land, we are going to give him a piece of land from the government. We are going to the government to buy the land from the taxes. We are going to collect for the ones who have land, very big areas.
So I'm going to ask you to
Yes,
start
I
wrapping
finish.
up.
But we are not going to give free land. We are going to give him the land free to cultivate. And after 5 years to tell him, to buy this land as a government, it costs this. If you want now the land to be your own, you have to return back the money we gave you without interest. So we're talking about justice. Huh? So not the people to go because they have connections to get the land and then to come to live in Johannesburg and to rent the car to have exploitation. So my question to you is, what radical legislation we need to solve the problem since 94. Now in a few weeks is the 30th anniversary of the liberation. So it's the best way to celebrate together by restore justice on land. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Could we? That's okay.
Thank you so much for the opportunity to ask the question. My name is Lindogu Mabaso. I'm representing LN24 SA. I'd like to respond to the question on whether enforcing the Constitution might actually lead to social instability and what exactly is our response to that. And I'd like to kindly respond by making reference to another constitutional court case judgment quite briefly. And I'm making reference to that to then bring it back to the question in case it seems unrelated. But essentially, the case was on Utwala. And of course, the court ruled that it was in fact child abduction and it was wrong that the child's parents had to return the child to, or rather should not have returned the child to the husband, so-called, who had abducted the daughter. When all of that was done and the court had made its decision and everyone was happy at that specific step in South African jurisprudence, a couple of legal enthusiasts went back to that community in Eastern Cape to observe what the reflections of the community were after the law had then contradicted what had been a norm, a cultural norm for the longest time. Individuals in that community responded in the majority by saying they did not understand why the court infringed on their cultural practices. Now, I made reference to this to say that just because something becomes a law, just because something is in the Constitution and we recognize a responsibility to enforce it, if people don't understand the process of implementation, especially in this instance where we're talking about implementing this provision in the Constitution in a much more radical or rather aggressive manner, if people don't understand the process of implementation, if people also don't trust the actor that is going to be primarily responsible for the process of implementation, i.e. considering that we're saying the state isn't in a much better economical and even strategic position to implement, certain provisions as far as redistribution is concerned today than they would have been 30 years ago. So in that instance, can we then not consider this in light of the fact that people who disagree or are concerned about the aggressive implementation of this provision aren't just descendants, which is of course not what you were saying, but they aren't just descendants of colonizers who want to keep their land. It's people from religious groups who are considering the fact that some people are now saying that even that land ought to be considered, especially Mataise from the EFF. But generally, the question is to say, isn't it necessary to consider the fact that especially the definition of what constitutional property is and the fact that it's left open-ended makes the discussion very uncomfortable for a lot of people because it adds to the lack of understanding in the process of implementation in what the actor is going to interpret as the necessary definition and therefore ultimately what ramifications stand to follow that particular definition or process of implementation. That's my question. Thank you.
Thank you. It was going to the gentleman beside you.
Tobelanda Desi. My name is Silo Ivan Pahle. I've got a question and a comment. So my question is, has redistribution not worked? Or is it those who were tasked with it? Are those the ones who have failed? And then my comment, I just want to, in making my comment, I want to make reference to the Agri-SA constitutional judgment. I come from the school of thought that believes in expropriation without compensation. And every time people talk about nationalization and custodianship, I always go back to this Agri-SA judgment because I believe in custodianship, which is the way the state should go. This is what the court said. It says, I'm just going to quote 3 paragraphs and I'll rest it there. It says, holders, here they're talking obviously about the mineral resource and petroleum rights. It says, holders were deprived of their mineral rights. It says, the state is now the custodian of the mineral and petroleum resources of this country on behalf of all South Africans, which is their common heritage. The MPRDA is the legal instrument through which Sebenza was deprived of its coal rights. This, therefore, is a compulsory deprivation. The custodianship of this and other mineral and petroleum resources is now vested in the state. The critical question is, however, whether the deprivation, the assumption of custodianship and the powers to grant others what previously had been granted only by the holders means that the state acquired ownership of rights to these mineral resource and petroleum resources. The answer is no. The state, as the custodian of these resources, is not seeking or supposed to be a co-contender with people or business entities for the right to prospect for a mine or mine these minerals. It is a facilitator through which broader and equitable access to mineral and petroleum resources can be realized. And I'm saying that if we expropriate land without compensation, you're making the state the custodianship. It's not nationalization. The state is not owning it. The state will be able to facilitate the redistribution, which has failed, but I feel like through this vehicle, the aggressive acceleration or the radicalization of the Constitution in order to redistribute land will be therefore achieved.
Yes.
Good afternoon all. I'm Hayley McCurr with the National Department of Human Settlements. And I just wanted to share with you our achievements in terms of what we've been able to do over the past years since 1994, and that is that we've constructed and built and provided service sites for over 3.5 million South Africans. And we continue to endeavor to provide service sites because we understand that government is constrained in terms of what we can do in terms of providing top structures. So I'm thinking that perhaps we need a definition in terms of what land is specifically, because when the department is providing serviced stands, are we not part of the redistribution process, is my question. And then thirdly, we also support the idea of expropriation. And expropriation, we firstly focus on the state as opposed to privately owned land. And when we say the state, we're thinking of the land that's in the custodianship of our state-owned enterprises. It is an asset in their books, so they're not able to provide it to the Department of Human Settlements just as a tick box. They have to go through a process because it also has value for them. So we in the process of negotiating for land release with our state-owned enterprises. And then when it comes to food security, the department is in the process of approving an agri-villages policy and program. And that is to support the areas that we've neglected, and we realize that over the years we've neglected the rural areas in terms of what we are able to do as a department. So that encourages the use of grey water and alternative building technologies so that we can create that enabling environment. We also recognize that South Africa is a water scarce country, so we need to be able to capacitate our rural beneficiaries to be able to farm for their own food. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that the Department of Agriculture, Land and Rural Development in the Western Cape, they did attempt to assist our beneficiaries to be able to grow their own food. But the success rate is very low because it really requires sweat equity. And it's easier to buy food than it is to grow food. So, so that mind shift also needs to happen with our communities to see the value of growing their own food. Thank you.
Thank you. To the gentleman.
Good morning, everybody. My name is Blessing Pela. I represent myself. Just starting with the figures on people who could potentially benefit from the restitution program. I don't think the figure is precise because we cannot be ahistorical about what really happened in this country. We need a historical perspective. If you consider that dispossession started not in 1913, it started with the coming in of the 3 ships, and whole communities were exterminated. The Khoisan, King Hinza in the Eastern Cape, Cape Colony, the battles that were fought by Dingaan, the Zulus, Battle of the Blood River, Sekhukhune, and so on. So if you actually count the cost in terms of human lives and property, it's not only land, it's land and livestock, other forms of property. So in the Constitution, when you deal with the notion of property, you should also consider the question of what people owned. And we also forget that in 1936, with the land trust, the betterment schemes, when people were headed into planned villages, where they were restricted to own a certain amount of land and livestock, the betterment schemes have not been addressed at all in terms of the restitution or redistribution program, especially the Eastern Cape and Limpopo. Those villages which are planned, they are called planned villages. So the numbers could potentially be far much more. So I actually contest the source that says it's only 5.7 million people. The second thing is, I think, is the legislative scheme, regime. When people were dispossessed, an objective situation of theft and robbery and military conquest was legislated and codified into law. There was a presumption that this land was not occupied. It was terra nullius. So the law of property, we started then, when they started actually, because the notion that our people did not have title to land is incorrect. They had indigenous title to land. And this Western system of law introduced registered title. And then by the 18th century, the deeds office in Cape Town started in Cape Town. Surveyor General's office started cutting off the law, land balkanizing, giving title only to white people and not blacks. So in claiming the land, you cannot objectively expect that blacks would have had title to land when they were historically denied that title. So they have indigenous title to land. So, and I was just dealing with that. And the question of the land reform program, we could go into I don't have the time, I must restrict myself and be disciplined about the time.
Thank you.
I'm just saying we should look at the 3 legs of land reform as cohesive, as being integrated. Redistribution, restitution, and land tenure reform. Because what happened throughout the years with dispossession, you had a systematic downgrading of tenure, where even people all over the country who were headed into homelands, even those who were in the urban areas. Here in Gauteng, only Alexandra and Everton had freehold rights. The rest of the people were tenants who could be removed at any time, at any point in time. So when you deal with the question of land, how do you do it? In 1994, the state had no money. There was a deficit. They did not have the financial muscle or capacity to buy that land. But what could have happened? My view is that we should have demanded reparation from the people who took the land. Because there is no way in which you can buy land. The question is not even one of market. It is just impossible, it's inconceivable that you could buy that land using public resources when we did not even have the budget to do so. So we cannot always blame the state. We must look at the objective situation. What system, I like that gentleman's reverend exposition, that we were caught in a system. Unfortunately, we allowed that system. And we proceeded from a system that put us in a position of disadvantage. We allowed an illegal, unlawful system to become a legal one. Even our approach to law is informed by that. Narrow approach of interpreting, positivist notion of law, of interpreting what exists. We don't question the fundamentals. So,
But Wam, I'm going to ask you to start wrapping.
yes, the last one, on market value.
Yes.
I do not agree that market value is the only sort of proxy. There was historical valuation which could have been used, which was part of the policy. There's agricultural value of the land which could have been used in terms of land policy. Market value, you can't exclude it because there are thousands, probably millions of transactions that are taking place every day through the deeds office. People are buying land every day, exchanging land. The deeds registers property everywhere, worth millions or billions of rands. But who buys that land? People from overseas, the corporates, the cartels. The land is going back as we speak into private hands because they have the means to buy that land. So there is the market system that is operating. Alongside that system, there's this other system, which is the state system, which is not operating. And we've got to actually go back to fundamentals. We could talk actually more about, I think we can argue the whole day about it, and I think we could talk about it, but let me give other people a chance. Thanks.
Yes.
Thank you. Thank you. I know that there are other hands. I'm going to give you a moment just to respond if there are questions you want to kind of pick out. And then with the indulgence of our hosts, I'm looking at you, Samir, take another round of questions if that'll be fine. Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I mean, look, on the international law front, look, there is no international law that says that foreigners can come into a place and then say that it belongs to them. And in fact, the international law is that when they've done that, they must give it back. You know. The debate on land in international law has been primarily how do you, because most of these debates are post-1960, you know, which is with all of the decolonization movement in Africa. You know, so when the British and the French and the Portuguese and the Italians and the Spanish, all of these guys were leaving. You know. What they did, they left us with so-called decolonial constitutions. And the most important clauses of those post-1960 constitutions were property. So when they were going back to Europe, they just made sure that they protected their property, quote unquote, here. You know. And so although they have left physically, the economy followed them to Europe. And most international law tried to make a fair system out of that, you know, to say, well, colonized people or formerly colonized people have a right of return. And when they exercise that right of return, there is no right to compensation at quote-unquote market value. In fact, the German constitution is probably one of the better ones on this because it says you will be paid a just and a fair value. What you will not have the quote-unquote market value. You know, that is also a distorted line. The problem is that we have not in this country been applying that international standard. You know, we've not been applying the international standard. We have been applying a market value standard, which is not part of the law. And this is a choice, a political choice that the government made in 1997. It should not have made that choice, that's been my argument, in cases of redistribution, expropriation, and restitution. It should have been applying the just and equitable standard, but it decided not to do that, and it applied the wrong standard. And so that explains why the cost of land has been as high as it has been. In 2019, I was in a discussion at Gibbs with the former Minister of Land Affairs. And I asked her the question, and I've been trying to get these statistics from the government itself about how much the government has paid for land reform. Like, what is the actual amount that you've paid for land reform? So anyway, she went up and down, and she was annoyed and whatever, but she eventually got one of her officials to find the figures. And she told me then that they had paid 60 billion rands for land reform. So I said, oh, thank you for that answer. I want to know where that money has gone. You know. She then confessed that the majority had gone to white people, white landowners, right? Either to pay for settlement of claims, or most importantly, to pay for what they call services that are associated with land. So they'll pay the lawyers, they'll pay the accountants, but they will also pay the owners who now look after this property to ensure its productivity. And very little actually went to beneficiaries. I thought this is an interesting revelation, because what it did show me was that our land reform that was meant to benefit black people has in fact benefited white people. You know, and this is one of the greatest distortions of freedom. You know. So in this country, we've not been applying the international standard. We've been applying a market standard that is not suited for South Africa's conditions. And so my argument has been to shift the policy to what it should have been, you know, which is, it's in the Constitution, you know, but we're not implementing the Constitution. And then the next thing to speak about maybe is around the, there's someone who was talking about, yes, about the custodianship of the state. I mean, I hear the point about agri-SA, etc. I've gone through this judgment several times. It's a judgment not about land, it's a judgment about minerals. The problem, you know, with the proponents of state custodianship is that they must go and explain that to black people. Because black people want to own the land. They want it in their hands. They don't want it in the hands of the state. You know? And whenever I speak to them, the communities that I represent, they make it very clear to me that we want this land in our name. And it is unacceptable for the government when we, for the first time in 350 years, have a chance to own the land. They tell it that they want to take it themselves. We want it in our name. So it's nice to talk about state custodianship in theory. There are no black communities that will accept state custodianship. No black communities. Nolunde and I have been involved in a case in KZN on the Ingonyama Trust. And there is state custodianship, right? But there is contestation. The communities say they want the land themselves. It doesn't belong to the chiefs, doesn't belong to the government, it belongs to them, right? So whenever you have a theoretical underpinning, which is not based on social reality, you get into this problem that people think in name, whether it's nationalization or custodianship, it works. In practice, it simply doesn't work. So my own approach to it is informed by experience, that I don't know a single black community that supports state custodianship. I know many political parties, but the problem is that I think that they are divorced from reality. They think they're speaking on behalf of black people, but they're speaking on behalf of themselves. So if you have that idea, then pass it through to them. The second problem is that experience elsewhere, you know, South Africans are coming late to this party of freedom. China, I mean, many despotic regimes, you know, have had state custodianship. It's never actually produced the outcomes that people desire, because people feel a sense of achievement once they own property, once they have title, etc. I mean, there are complications with title, but you must go to those celebrations every time there's a title deed. You know, once there has been a successful land claim, you go to those parties and you see how emotional those communities are, that they finally own the land. You know. So blacks have had a different relationship to minerals than to land. So for land, they will insist that it should be held and written in their names. They want their name on the title deed. Right? Now, that's one problem. The second problem is that the MPRDA was passed in 2002. We are now 21 years after. It has not resulted in the transfer of mineral wealth to black people. You see, it's still the Lonmins, the Anglo-Americans, the De Beers, etc., who have in fact benefited from the provisions of the MPRDA. There's a clause there, I think it's section 105 or section 104, that says that a community is entitled to apply for a mineral right if the minerals are in the land where the community resides. The strange thing is that that clause has never actually been used because it has a problem inside. It requires the community to be recognized as the owner. The problem is that most communities are not the owners. It is the state that owns the land because of a historical problem that communities have not been owners of the land. And even where they did become the owners of the land, Bengwenyama is a perfect example of this because Bengwenyama was exactly about this clause. They always require a private sector player for purposes of capital investment or for purposes of a technical support. So Agri-SA is a good theoretical judgment with very little practical consequences for the real transfer of mineral wealth to black hands. In fact, when I went to the annual conference, the mining conference, I went there to speak about land. I proposed the radical reform of the MPRDA because it has not produced the outcomes that were. And in fact, it's very funny because the government said, no, we need to own these minerals in order to address the problem of poverty in mining communities. The problem is now quadrupled. And the government, some of the officials of government are now owners of mines themselves. You know. So you can expect that as well. When the politicians say, no, give this thing to us, we want to own it for you, you can expect that the first thing they will do is to allocate it to themselves. Yeah. So if that is the system you want, that's fine. You know, but that's not the system I want. Look, I agree, Mr. Mpela, with everything you've said. I think there's just a misunderstanding of what I was saying, because I was not saying that restitution should have benefited 5.7 million people. I was saying it was designed to benefit 5.7 million people, because restitution was based on a 1913 cutoff date, and it was to resolve a specific problem of forced removals. But if you want to solve the South African problem of land injustice, you cannot rely on restitution. You have to rely on something else. And the only something else we have in the Constitution is redistribution, which is that black people must be given land because they don't have it and they cannot afford it. And that's really the simple way of, and that is how the ANC actually thought about this as well. I mean, you say that, look, titles were actually started not in the 1800s. They were actually started in the 1650s in Van Riebeeck's Republic in the Cape. That's when they started giving titles. And they, in fact, it's interesting how these Dutch, they did give black people title. They gave a lot of enslaved, what do they call, free slaves. Yes, so if you were once enslaved and you became free, they would actually give you title. Yes, so give you title. And you could own a vineyard. And then in the 1700s, they took back all of those vineyards. But there's a fascinating period of about 50 years where formerly enslaved people are actually landowners and actually producing. And even in the Cape, the British system, so that was the Dutch system, and even when they introduced the British system in the Cape, it was not originally exclusively racist. I mean, in my book, I write about Princess Emma, who was in fact a title holder of Sandile's daughter, Sandile, the king of the Nqika. Sandile's daughter actually had 2 titles over land, which she then rented out to 2 white farmers. And so the system was not always clear cut about what they were trying to do. You know, I suppose somebody did say when I mentioned the example of Emma Sandile that it's also because she was the daughter of a king. But overall, the policy was still a policy of racism and gender discrimination. Yeah. So it's just to give that perspective as well, that titles and race, the British policy was sometimes contradictory and not always a clear cut. It's the National Party that was clear about what it was doing. I mean, for the National Party, race was everything.
I'm going to ask you to pause.
Yeah, I'm done.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. There were at least 2 hands in that row there. Burning questions, burning comments. 1, the gentleman in the glasses. 2, the other gentleman in the glasses. And 3, my sister in the back. 4, crisp, guys, huh? Crisp.
Not on land. No one is crisp on land.
You can catch Tembeka at lunch, you know.
Definitely, eh.
Oh, yeah.
Thank you very much. My name is Mafule Muswani. Actually, this conversation is very triggering, you know. I wish, I'm glad we are relating, right? And I agree mostly with the, submissions that have been made, but I'm feeling like there is a sense of trying to appease, I'm hearing concepts of international, right? Do the international people really have the right to prescribe how we as indigenous people particularly, or African people, have to run our affairs, which are of course the people who really got us to where we are here? That do we still have that inferior capacity, right? And are we also even trusting the Constitution, right? Should we be trusting the Constitution? I'm asking that question, that who was there when this Constitution was being designed? And we know some of the answers, but I'm saying, is it a tool that is best benefiting us? Because if it was really a good thing that is applauded to be, we could have made progress. So I think this is a comment and a question to say that we, even in how we have this conversation, right, shouldn't we be saying the whites are the land thieves, as they are supposed to be called, not landowners, right? So that people can be educated to know that the land was stolen, right? And if we're having a conversation about justice, should we even be thinking about people buying the land? How do I buy something that was stolen from me? So, and obviously I am young, and I think I have emotions. I don't want them to take over, but I'm saying let us, engage and entertain that. But also to know that change is a painful thing, and if there has to be some kind of pain for particularly the generation that has to take a new baton, because I think generations upon generation have to fight some different kind of fights. What fight are we going to fight? And what pain are we going to feel and others should feel? Are we going to take the land back, and how will it look like?
Thank you.
We will observe. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Can we pass it to this gentleman here? Oh, he's got one. Fantastic. Thank you. Oh.
Okay, thank you very much. My name is Musiwa Daniel Madika. I'm from the Department of Philosophy in the University of Johannesburg. I think I have 2 or 3 questions. I'm trying to find the marriage between the Freedom Charter and the process of redistribution, which I suppose is supposed to be in the Constitution of the Republic. Now, the Freedom Charter says that the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. So in the process of redistribution...
Well, it starts off by saying South Africa belongs to all who live in it.
Of course. Now, in the process of redistribution, which I suppose is supposed to be, like I said, in the Constitution. Who is going to be responsible, number one, for the process of redistribution? Is it the state, when we are already in this kleptocracy and mafia state that we are in? And then number two, still in the same context, what is your interpretation in terms of how the process of redistribution aligns with the Freedom Charter? Because I suppose that is the end goal, that is where we are trying to go. And also, what are the limitations, or what will be the limitations in this redistribution? When we give you the land, what am I supposed to do if I don't want to farm? I'm saying I need the land, yes, but I'm not going to use it for the purpose of farming. But we agree that in the Freedom Charter, the land shall be shared amongst those who work it. So am I working the land if I don't farm on it, or if I don't use it for commercial purposes? And then the last one is how do you go and tell the people who are in the villages and the people who are in predominantly white people that the right process to taking back the land or having back the land is redistribution? For example, myself, I'm from the Free State province, and you have a lot of people who are farming. They have land all over the place. And there's this fear and romanticizing in our people that when we speak about the land and taking back the land from the private sector, like you said, our people will tell you that, hey, hey, we're going to starve and all that. So how do we go about working around that process? Thank you.
Thank you. The next one is our sister in the back.
Okay, I'll try and be quick because I can write a thesis about my questions. My name is Yoli Iswa, and I am a budding scholar on land justice, and so I appreciate this conversation very much. As some comrades know, this thing keeps me awake at night. And I do have a personal reference with dispossession. Our claim is post-98, so it's frozen. And instead of maybe rationalizing this, I think the pain is deepening, and I'm becoming more and more irrational about it. So I know, advocates, you always talk about land is the instrument to protect the weak, but I also wonder if it's in the hands of the powerful, it also can be a destructive tool. And my contributions really lean on, I think as a generation we have a duty to question the law if it doesn't serve. And I reference Ramose on Mulato Gauboli, you know. And the thing that, for me, on Section 25, and I accept your annoyance, I appreciate it, I read your work, so I appreciate your annoyance there, but I just can't help look at substance versus form. The rights are in conflict. You've got this some negative rights, you've got the expropriation allowance, but in reality, the two are constrained. And you have a constitution that provides for compensation explicitly. Yes, market value is one of the factors, but in reality, through the Geldenhuys formula, it's the standard that's get used. And I know that Chaskalsin, if I'm correct, had warned that a property clause at transition would cause this conundrum. So my thing is, with the Constitution Amendment Bill having failed, the expropriation bill, thanks to your work, I got exposed that it's actually not an instrument for private land reform. It's not worth the debate it's having right now because it's actually not even for the purposes that we're looking after. And even some of the cases you've set in, there's been a reversal on the enforcement of market value, of less than market value. And I've read your work on just and equitable compensation. I'm like, if we did this case by case, it won't be even 700 and something years, it would be 2,000 years, you know? So my thing is, with this said, surely we have to challenge the constraints that are being placed because of the law. And in my humble opinion, and I'm not a lawyer, the property clause is a constraint to land reform. And then the other thing that I'm going to close right now is, I just wonder if we've theorized sufficiently on justice for land, honestly, as a country. Because some of the work I look at on historical justice it talks about rectificatory responsibilities of beneficiaries of injustice. And in this country, we almost don't open up that conversation to say someone is responsible for the historical injustice. And that, for me, then changes the posture on what needs to happen around restoration. And also, I think theorizing about justice helps us to what was actually lost. And I tie this to what Lundo was saying about productivity. I traditionally come from an accounting background, so the numbers I know matter, but when you look at what was actually lost, the question is beyond dispossession. The question is about societal creation. And the work, I would refer everyone to recently is Mbuso Nkosi's work on labor tendencies and starting to think about the communities wanted a relationship with the land, and it reveals attachment that are beyond ownership. And so even with, I get your point, and I know my family also wants the land, and for restitution, maybe that's the answer. But there's another question also on redistribution where perhaps the relationship transcends even ownership. And considering that land is a finite resource, maybe there is a solution that isn't individual or maybe community or family-based ownership. These are some of the things. I've got many questions, but I'll give others a chance.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And then we come to our final hand here.
Afternoon, everyone. How you doing?
Hello.
We're fine.
Are you good? Very grave discussion we're having. First point I'd like to touch upon, you talked about 80% of households consuming stuff from the shops. I think as people of color, we need to waken so that we start producing. We've just started indulging in a consumerist lifestyle and culture. We don't produce anything. Not even you can't even plant tomatoes, you gotta go buy. So we have to fix that. We just have to become woke, start producing, And then you also talked about the productivity rates of the land. It doesn't matter, just give the land to who owns it, to who it's supposed to go to. Then we'll talk about productivity later. Anyway, I think as descendants of this native land, they need ownership of the land, regardless of productivity. Somewhere along the line, we're going to figure it out how to, plow crops and whatever. Ownership needs to go to the rightful people, right? And what else? I got an excerpt from Malcolm X's 1963 speech, right? He talks about revolution is based on land. Land is the basis of all independence. Land is the basis of freedom, justice, and equality. Then he continues to say, a revolution is bloody. Revolution is hostile. Revolution knows no compromise. Revolution overturns and destroys everything that gets in its way. With that said, the Constitution, as we speak, is just a piece of paper. It's meaningless. Doesn't do anything for us. That's it.
Thank you. I am keeping an eye on time and do apologize to our hosts. I'm going to give you a moment to kind of give a bit of a closing response, condense it all into one. And then I think we will have done our portion. So over to you.
No, I just wanted to, there's a lady there at the back. She's really excellent, the exposition. Firstly, the exposition and the critique of my position. I think it's truly excellent because it's actually a reflection that she's engaging with the substance, and then she's appreciating the constraints and the possibility. I agree with your overall point about the lack of theorization about, you call it justice for land, but I think it's where the burden of injustice falls. Who bears that burden of injustice in South Africa? I think that's really the problem. So the law was meant to shift that burden from the dispossessed to the former oppressors. So that's what was the intention of the law. The practice of the law has been something different. Because what's happened is that burden of injustice has been shifted back to the dispossessed, largely because of the incapacity of national parliament and incapacity of the state, etc. And also the serious contestation from the former oppressors. And people forget this, that actually every attempt at reforming anything, even with 1 inch, has been met with massive resistance. They've opposed everything. They have not given an inch. They have opposed everything. And at every time we take a step forward, we always have to find a way of, okay, how do we accommodate them so that they don't oppose us, so that we can make at least one step forward. And that's where this burden of land injustice has actually been borne by the formerly oppressed. The question then is again another. I mean, that's why I'm really excited that you spoke and you raised the issues you raised, because then the question then becomes one of, well, if we accept that the burden of injustice still falls on the oppressed or the formerly oppressed. Of course, there's now collaboration, because some of the formerly oppressed are now working with the former oppressors, blah, blah, blah. So they're oppressing the lot of us. Then the question is, well, what is the role of law in that? What's the role of law in that? So you can take the view that actually there is no role for law. So let's remove the law and then let's remain with what? Politics, military, and economics. And then see where we end with that. And countries that have tried that have ended up in complete ruins, total ruins. And everywhere you remove the law, it's the poor, the marginalized, and the weak that are the victims. The people that always control a lawless state are the people with money and with guns. So then you must decide if that is where you want to be. My view, I'm a constitutionalist. I'm actually a very proud constitutionalist. But my view is to look at the Constitution as an instrument of reform. You see. And my own experience of my own people where I come from is that they too pin their hopes in the Constitution. Mm-hmm. You know what they ask me when I'm there? They say, no, okay, they still think I'm a youngster. They say that we hear you speaking a lot of English in Johannesburg about this Constitution. When is it arriving here in my village? That's really what they want. These ideas about let's destroy the Constitution are actually ideas that come from the lecture theaters. They don't come from real people. Real people are waiting for this water that was promised in this Constitution. They're waiting for this land that was promised in this Constitution. They're waiting for these roads that were promised in this Constitution. They say, well, I will be with you as well. I will support you in your constitutionalism stance, only if you can prove that this Constitution works for me. So that for me has been the biggest lesson of my own life, that my job as a lawyer is to actually bring this Constitution to these people that were promised 30 years ago. And that's my approach also to land, is that actually they say the land said there's going to be, the Constitution said there's going to be restitution. But there's still no restitution here. They said we would get this land for free. We still don't have it. So I think that's really the problem that South Africa currently faces, is this gap between what the law promises and what the politics have delivered. And I think that the challenge for activists is trying to bridge that gap. Now, there is obviously scope for critique, and your point is good there. There's scope for critique, but it's critique that's directed, at resolving the problem of injustice, and that's my own critique. So those are the reflections I would give to your point. But I'm looking forward to what you write in the end. Looking forward to reading it. There are no answers to this. This is, Pius Langa, the Judge Pius Langa, was asked, what is transformation? He said, well, transformation is not a destination. It's not something you arrive at. It's a way of life. It's something you aspire towards, but it's something you do every day. And so you can say, oh, well, the Constitution is a piece of paper. So what are we doing here? Why are we talking instead of being outside and learning to fight? So the problem is that everything has to be resolved by dialogue. That is our experience. Nelson Mandela, I'm glad we're at the Mandela Foundation. Probably the greatest revolutionary of the 20th century, Nelson Mandela, single-handedly, one of the greatest revolutionary of the whole 20th century. He actually established a military army, Konto Wesizwe, right? He left a law firm, and he was not a youngster, he was in his 40s. Left a law firm, started an army. He came back to the realization that everything is resolved by dialogue. And so when we insist, some of us who are constitutionalists, on dialogue, we are also talking about history. And we're trying to create a new system that we currently have. And we're trying to call out injustice. It's not, oh, no, these are cowards, I actually can do a better job. I always hear these people say, no, if the transition should have produced something different, that's fine. I don't think personally, if I was there, I would have negotiated a better deal. So I accept that's the product. I work with that product, and I accept it has weaknesses, it has limitations. I'm trying to reform that product, so that the future is better than the past. So that's why I like what you say, because I think it shows seriousness in engaging with the current challenge and seriousness in thinking about the future. And that's probably why the dialogue has been important. Thank you.
Thank you so much. And I want to return to a question that I had probed earlier when I started, which is we have to ask ourselves, how long can we really wait as a country before we reckon with the pain of our past and do the necessary repair and redistributive work, especially in relation to land. And on that note, I'm going to hand over to Professor Vern Harris, our acting CEO, to do a wrap-up.
Good afternoon, everybody. I always enjoy listening to Tembega, Nolundi. It's always rich, many lines of inquiry, but I have to say I'm left today with a deep sense of frustration. And, the points that were made about how in the 90s there was a strong realization that we needed to transform our society fundamentally, and that instruments for redistribution were put in place, but have not been implemented. We've been focusing on land, but we're actually talking about wealth. More broadly, is that the wealth of this nation, this land, has not been redistributed. I think the question for us at the Nelson Mandela Foundation, this is not just a talk shop for us. This is informing the work that we do. And in this area of land, we've made contributions. The process that Ntate Motlanthe led, the process you led, the question becomes what comes out of those processes? I know that review by Ntate Motlanthe was responded to by, I think, every political party in Parliament except the ANC. And it becomes a question for us, what is it that we can contribute in terms of the advocacy work that needs to be done moving forward? We'll keep wrestling with that. Thanks to all of you who contributed to the conversation today. We're not leaving it here. This is a continuing process for us. Thank you to the team, Sumaya, Samantha, Taylor. Great job as always. Appreciated. Lastly, we do have lunch downstairs. And you're invited to come join us and to continue the conversation. Thank you for coming and supporting the Nelson Mandela Foundation.